Hi, Mike. I see you're here.
Yep. Hello.
That's a gigantic bee behind your head.
Yep.
They are out in full force now. Seeing lots and lots.
I've seen common eastern bumblebees. I haven't seen one of these yet this year. That's a brown belted bumblebee. And I've seen carpenter bees.
Yeah, I'm not good at my identification as they whiz by me yet. So I'm not sure what I'm seeing, just several, and lots of wasps too.
Yep, there were some paper wasps flying around today, and a couple got stuck in our greenhouse. I didn't catch them to see if they're native or European.
I take the phone off a hook.
Yeah, probably. So I tested screen sharing. It seemed to work.
Great.
I'll just make sure the sound works.
Okay. Last week was really great. So many people emailed and said how full of information it was, how much they loved it, and they're looking forward to this week. So
Good.
hopefully
Okay, let's see if you can hear the bees buzz again tonight.
Okay. Yep, I hear buzzing.
All right, we're all set then.
Awesome. All right, I will bring my screen up until we get to you. Going to Hi, everybody. We're going to give it just a couple more minutes while people file in. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know that it's a little bit of a challenge because it's so fabulous outside, but Mike has lots of great information to share with us. I'm excited for our presentation. And then we have I find a very fascinating thought of the month after the presentation. The board has been brainstorming about how to help people identify early emerging native plants. So we are going to do a whole segment as the thought of the month on identifying a bunch of things that are coming up right now. So stick around after the main presentation for that. Mike, with just like a tiny announcement, then we'll get you started. I'm going to open the chat.
Whenever you're ready.
Yes, Denise, I couldn't pull myself away. I had to act like an adult and set a timer on my phone and be like, okay, you've got to go do your work for the meeting at this time. Stop digging in the dirt. But then I just pulled my laptop outside and was like, happy compromise.
Oh, you are outside. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, that's great.
And nobody will remember this, but last year, I think probably the April or May meeting, I couldn't tear myself away and had to be outside. And when my husband either looked at the recording or something, he was like, we can't have that, the neighbor's house as your backdrop. Like that's just unacceptable. So now I have this beautiful, I don't know how to make my arm work, this beautiful privacy wall that he built us. And I have jessamine and Lonicera dioica planted here to vine up it. So maybe next year, the April meeting when I'm outside, that'll be covered in vines, hopefully.
Oh, it will, because my jessamine just started to bloom.
Yeah, mine is really budded, very like lots and lots of buds, and I just put it in the fall. So I got it from Gino's, and I was so excited. Their plants there were just so lovely.
Aren't they? Yeah. I was there today, scooped up a couple of trees.
I'm sorry I missed that.
I said I was there today and scooped up a couple of trees.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
my
I have to
trees
get
this
back
year.
there. They have a lot of good evergreens that I don't see other places.
Oh, they do. They have that gray owl, Juniper virginiana, I think.
Yes, I've
That's
had my
pretty
eye on that.
Me too. Agreed.
Denise, it is a rain chain and it has hummingbirds on it. It's lovely.
So
Okay.
cool.
All right, guys. So our meeting will be recorded. Hopefully everybody will get to watch who doesn't get to attend, but we're going to get started. Whoop, sneak peek. So this is the board. We are Wild Ones of Southeastern PA. We are the local chapter of the national nonprofit Wild Ones. I'm Jessie. I'm the president. We're looking for a vice president if you're interested. Susan takes care of our newsletter, which everybody gets whenever we have a meeting. And she's also our secretary. So she puts information up on our website and our Facebook. Denise is our treasurer, keeps our money in order, which we will get to spend this year, putting lots of native plants in the ground. Judy, I'm not sure is on tonight or not yet, but she is our new membership chair. So when new members join or when people reach out looking for information about membership, Judy takes care of a welcome email and keeps that up to date. Our board members, Marilyn and Rick, help us make great decisions. And Judy is also, well, actually all of us are board members. And then we're starting up a homeowner advising committee. We're looking for a chair, but we have our first grantee. So that's very exciting. And then a community projects committee chair could also be you. So every time I look on Facebook, and I'm part of all sorts of plant groups, I see all of the terrible things about calorie pear and all of the invasives that are creeping up right now. So I thought I'd give everybody just a little glimpse of plant this instead of that, because they're so pretty right now and they are stark difference to all the bad headlines about the invasives that are happening. So our native Paxandra instead of the Japanese Paxandra, it is in full bloom right now. The blooms come out before the fresh new leaves. So those leaves that you see in the picture are from last year. They overwintered like that. It does not stay as evergreen as the Japanese Paxandra, but it's at least semi-evergreen. It's a little slower growing. It won't take over any place, but it will happily cohabitate with spring ephemerals. It's a really lovely plant. The Amelanchier we had featured last year in one of our trees of the month, and that is in full bloom right now. I'm hoping that I'll get berries this year. This was probably the second year that it's bloomed. I don't think that I got berries last year, though I could have gotten a couple and the birds stole them before I noticed. It's a small tree right now. And then I think I talked about Phlox stolonifera last meeting, but it is even more blooming now. It is just fantastic. And I have grape hyacinth that have volunteered themselves all over the place because I have neighbors who put them in the ground on purpose, and they end up at my place. But I thought that this purple is even more pretty than the grape hyacinth, so it'd be a great replacement. I wanted to clear up something really quickly because I think I misspoke last meeting, been last week, talking about the 3 different strawberries that we encounter. This yellow strawberry that is our native barren strawberry is a great replacement instead of lesser celandine. So if you're seeing yellow flowers, you can hope that they're barren strawberry right now. They do keep a evergreen basil rosette. They're very happy right now. They spread nicely as a ground cover that jumps around. They're not going to make one huge mat like a lesser celandine, but same color from a distance. They look very similar. The native Virginia strawberry has white flowers. It is more mounding, but it jumps by runners, just like the strawberries that you buy to eat. And then the mock strawberry, which is the invasive with yellow flowers that spreads everywhere, is very hard to control. Also spreads by runners, has small fruit that I don't know that many things eat, but these are the ones you want to try and control. I have a mat of them lots of places, unfortunately.
They're very bad. The thing to identify them as the 3 or 5 big leafy bracts that stick out between the petals of the flowers. That tells you it's the Duchesnea indica, or which is now Potentilla indica by some botanists. But those leafy bracts that stick way out almost as long as the petals.
Excellent. So yeah, pull them up when you can. I know that I have more and more every year, even when I try and pull them. So keep at it. And then with that, Mike, we're going to turn it over to you. I'm going to stop my screen share. Mike is going to share some of his information, the special relationships in the pollination story tonight. Stop share. All right, Mike, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, is everyone seeing my screen okay?
Yes.
All right, good. All right. Lots of stuff to talk about tonight. We'll see how far we get, hopefully far enough. So one thing I wanted to talk about is there's advantages and disadvantages plants about pollination. So let's look at Virginia Spring Beauty, which are in bloom this week, just starting. You've probably noticed if you've been out how variable the flower color is. Goes from almost white with just a little pink veins like the one in the center to ones that are very pink, like the bottom left one. And it's the research, there was a researcher in Indiana that studied these a bunch, and they have a lot of interesting things going on. But one is he found that the pinker they are, the more likely they are to be pollinated. So the question is, why haven't they gone all pink then? Well, the problem is there's a competing negative advantage or disadvantage. The more pink they are, the more likely they are to be eaten by herbivores like deer. So there's a balance in the population. If the deer population's high, they'll tend to eat the pink ones. If there's not many deer, or I don't know if rabbits eat them, they'll tend to be more pink in the population, and it sort of seesaws back and forth depending upon the herbivore pressure. So it's very fascinating that way. And that's why they haven't gone to an optimal color, because there's a pressure that way. The other thing is there's a very interesting little bee, a native bee, Andrena eriginei, which is named after the harbinger of spring flower, which isn't quite native to eastern Pennsylvania. It comes into Lancaster, I understand, mostly western PA. But it's very efficient. It actually likes Virginia Spring Beauty to collect pollen. It's so efficient at collecting the pollen, it actually does no pollination to the plant. It collects and either eats it all or feeds it all to its offspring. It's like no good at all. So there's a disadvantage to the plant, and having specialist pollinators aren't always the very best. And at least in this one case that's been documented, they're overdo it. So I've been thinking about this pink versus white and deer, and there's some other things like Dutchman's breeches, Dicentra cuculata, is usually white. There are pinkish ones sometimes, but that seems to vary by temperature this spring. And I don't know if that affects deer browsing as well, but these on the center and on the right were all taken at Shanks Ferry one year in Lancaster County when we had a cool spring and some cold nights, and they really were very pink that year. And so was the squirrel corn, Dicentra canadensis, the same place at the same time. They were very pink there that year. And I don't know if that makes a difference in herbivores or not. But an important thing to note is these spring ephemerals, like squirrel corn and Dutchman's breeches, are very important for bumblebees. Because right now, all the bumblebees you see are queens. They're founding queens. They're looking for a place to build their first, start their nest, their colony for the year. And they need nectar to keep going and do that, and then to collect pollen as they start making their first brood cells and starting their colony. So these spring ephemerals are very important. And there's been some documentation of deer browsing on spring ephemerals negatively impacting bumblebees. So they're important. And then we have our other Dicentra eximia, the wild bleeding heart. And I wonder if one of the reasons it might be rare is because it gets eaten more by deer. There's just a few populations in eastern Pennsylvania of this. It's more common up in the mountains of West Virginia. But there is one population here in Reading at Neversink Mountain, and it's up at the High Gap Nature Center too. And another plant that may have the same issue is mountain wood sorrel, which is a more northern species. I've seen a few places towards this southeastern Pennsylvania. It usually looks like the right-hand one, white with pink stripes, very similar in sort of appearance to the spring beauty. But the pink ones on the left and here, this is in my garden. This is from a population up in northern Pennsylvania. This is a known variety that's all pink, and apparently maybe it's deer pressure. And when it's cloudy or rainy and cold, they stay facing down, so the deer, if they're browsing, don't really see the pink either. It's sort of hidden by the backs of the petals. So I think that's interesting. Another plant, which is, the deer like to eat the leaves in my yard of Canada waterleaf, which is a rather spreading plant, but it's going to bloom in June. And bumblebees like it, even though the flowers are hidden beneath the leaves. So it's really a great plant for bees, but they don't have to advertise. The bees apparently know to go looking. I don't detect any fragrance to the flowers myself. I'm not sure if they just know to go look under the leaves or if there's a fragrance that only bumblebees can detect. But I like all the water leaves, and the Canada waterleaf is my favorite because of its blooming time. After this, most of the spring things are done. It's a real bridge plant for the woods. So now we're going to get back into the pollination, talking about the insects a little more. So which reward are the insects after? Do they want nectar or pollen or both? Or even none? Maybe they just want to catch one of the other insects that's visiting. So a lot of insects want the nectar. Most want the nectar because it's a good source of sugar. So you don't have to have a big flower necessarily to produce a lot of nectar. A lot of little flowers can be as good. So Maryland figwort, Scrophularia marylandica, and this is a close-up of the stunning flower, is native around here. It's quite tall, 7 or 8 feet even. Bees love it. According to Heather Holm in one of her books, there was a study done of fields of Maryland figwort. I believe it was in Arkansas or Oklahoma. And they found the greatest honey production per acre from Maryland figwort over any other plant. So even though the flowers are tiny, they're visited by all kinds of pollinators. So here's a potter wasp. And another plant that has tiny flowers, you may notice a native, this is the native white verbena, verbena verticifolia, or white vervain. Tiny, tiny little flowers, but if there's enough of them, they can be worthwhile for bees to visit, and they get there and hang on. There needs to be a big enough population to make it a stop worthwhile for them to learn. So bees, according to Bernd Heinrich in his book Bumblebee Economics, have majors and minors. So in a given day, they'll have a species of flowers that's their major flower. Then they'll have a couple that are minors that they visit and keep track of. As the major flower may finish blooming and go out of bloom and become less important, one of the minors will take over. The bee will switch to that as its new major flower. And that varies by individual bee in the colony. That's not a colony thing. That's what that individual bee has learned. So Verbena verticifolia, white vervain can be important, but blue vervain's usually better and has bigger flowers. It's a great meadow plant, tall, and it's not showy if you just have one plant, but if you have enough of them, like this meadow that we planted near Birdsboro, beginning of COVID, I thought I had a bigger picture. It's just full of them. And the bees love it. Butterflies don't seem to visit this, at least in my yard. There's only a few plants, and pasture thistles here are one, that are big enough that one flower head is enough to be worthwhile stop. So this is regal fritillary butterflies at Fort Indian Town Gap, the only population left in Pennsylvania, which happens to be where I met Sherry Moyer of Hungry Hook Farm. She was the person that worked with me when I did bee studies there. This pasture thistle, I don't know if everyone's familiar with regal fritillaries. They're as big or slightly bigger than a monarch butterfly. So that's a huge flower, over 3 inches across, or flower head with lots of nectar. You can watch a regal fritillary coming across a field. There won't be anything, and you can tell when it spots the pasture thistle and starts making up, not a bee line, a butterfly line straight towards it. It comes zooming in. And that's how we found that butterfly on the right, which is a really odd, rare variant of the regal fritillary with the extra white spots that we were very excited to find a few years ago. So you want to plant in groups and get bigger clumps of things so the bees don't have to travel so far. Here's my big blue vervain picture. Get enough of them and the bees will make it your stop. So
Mike.
bees and butterflies are, yeah.
Mike, do you be able to share with us how to tell the difference between native thistle and what probably most of us have, the non-native invasive thistle?
Sure. Okay, so we have commonly in this part of Pennsylvania 3 species of native thistles: swamp thistle, field thistle, and pasture thistle. They're all biennials. They all die after blooming. So they have a overwintering rosette the first year, and then the second year they bloom. All of them have stems which are basically bare. They're not spiny. The invasive species, bull thistle and nodding thistle are the other big ones. They have winged spiny stems. I can sometime show pictures of those. So if you see ones that have green leafy material on the stem with spines sticking out, that's one of the non-native ones, either bull thistle or pasture or nodding thistle. The other non-native one that's really common, of course, is Canada thistle, which is a perennial and has much smaller flowers, less than ½ an inch across the flower heads, tiny flowers. And that's the one that's everywhere on the roadsides, and PennDOT spreads the seeds everywhere as they're mowing. And theoretically, you're supposed to control it, but you don't. So all our native thistles are in trouble because there's several introduced seed weevils that eat the seeds. And since they're biennials, they need to reseed themselves. They don't maintain themselves without that. And the seed weevils were introduced apparently to control the invasive species that they prefer our native ones. They've switched over. So all our thistles are in trouble. And the pasture thistle is the most in trouble of those common 3 ones here in Pennsylvania. And the only place I see it anymore is at Fort Indian Town Gap. There was one population in a game lands near me that has disappeared. The last one I saw bloom got cut down by the highway department of the township 2 or 3 years ago. So it's gone. And I have grown it from seed, but it gets so many seed weevils. I don't think it gets any to distribute any seed. So, all right, I could keep going about thistles, but
Mark did just want to know, is it only found at the gap because of fire disturbance, or is it just habitat loss?
I think it's just that it's the right habitat. It's got the good pollinators. It still does get hit with the seed weevils, but apparently that flower. So each little purple streak sticking out of the top is one pistil of this can produce one seed. So a flower head like this can produce 200 or 300 seeds. So it only takes a couple of them to escape the weevils to keep it going there. And the fires help because it needs bare soil for the seeds to land on at some point. They can't germinate if they're hanging up in a bunch of dead grass or something. So it does need disturbance. So I like thistles. I could keep going, but so you want to have clumpiness, you want to have enough of something. So one, if you're trying to benefit pollinators or you want to attract pollinators, just one of any given plant probably isn't enough. You need to have a big enough clump to be a worthwhile stop for the insects to come. So now we'll get into some of the specialized things. So I talked a little bit before about pollen placement. Most insects and birds really don't like to have pollen all over their face and so forth, so they try to get around it. We'll talk a little bit about that. And plants don't want animals to get the reward without providing the service. They want to make sure they're sacrificing the energy to make nectar and give away pollen, that they're getting pollinated. And there are a bunch of animals that cheat, that do nectar robbing. And then there's some flowers that falsely label and don't provide any reward. They just lure the insect in with a decoy. And I think I mentioned a little bit before about why are bees so good at pollinating, and why are bees, what's going on with them? Bees are a group of wasps. I believe I said before, subgroup. They're in the middle of the family tree of wasps, but they're a group that happen to be particularly hairy, and they have branched hairs. They're very fuzzy. The hairs have branches if you look at least somewhere on their body, and those branch hairs are good at trapping pollen. And so when plants started producing a lot of pollen, the bees started picking it up, and eventually bees went vegan. They eat only pollen and nectar. There's a few wasps since then that have gone the same route, but they aren't as good at pollinating. But bees prefer to visit flowers that are abundant enough to make efficient collecting trips. And butterflies are looking for plants that have enough nectar to be worthwhile. And they want to learn what's good, and they want to do efficient shopping trips. So bees, like this bumblebee, this is a brown-belted bumblebee on a shrubby St. John's wort, one of my favorite native St. John's worts. The St. John's worts, the hypericums, produce no nectar in the flowers, only pollen. Then bees land and run through it and scoop up the pollen. So what I've watched, bees will tend to go get nectar, and when they're full of nectar, then they come and finish up their load of pollen and then head back to the nest. So they finish it up. So some plants, like I mentioned last time, have to provide the reward, but they make sure that the insect has to get past the entrance, go past the style and the pistil, and can do the pollination in order to get the reward. So they're very deep flowers. So a flower like this, only one of the group of long-tongued bumblebees can really be efficient at getting in. But there's also a few small bees that are good at crawling all the way in to the flower of this native morning glory. So can you see the bee in there? He's just tucked down in there. But as I mentioned before, sometimes these deep flowers, some butterflies, the skippers have such long proboscises, they can get in and not get any nectar. Now, this is a bindweed, one of the calistegias, but this is a native one. So you can't count all of them as invasive. You have to start doing some identification. All the ones I see in my yard are the invasive ones, invasive bindweeds. So squash bees and squashes are a cool, really cool bee. They're native to Mexico, apparently, but as Native Americans moved squashes and cultivated them and moved them north, the bees followed along behind them. So if you grow squashes, squash, pumpkin, butternut squash, acorn squash, any of those, and you go out, you will probably, if you look in the morning, see some squash bees with their really striped abdomens in there. And often then the males will stay in the flower as it closes up for the day and just use it as a hotel room, because they pretty much only pollinate and visit in the morning. But this is the place they wait to find a female. That's their dating spot. So without the plant, they wouldn't find that. There are other bees that like squash flowers, bumblebees and some others are good at visiting squash bees, but squash bees are fun to find in the flowers. And they need, like almost all, not all, most of our native bees, which we have over 400 species here, nest in the ground. They dig tunnels in soil. So they usually need some bare soil or soil with sparse grass on it at the most, so they can do nesting. And figuring out how to encourage good nesting places for bees is something that a lot of bee researchers are working on right now. Okay, the pea family. Everyone knows the pea family. This is my favorite native pea, goat's rue, Tephrosia virginiana. There's an invasive plant that has the common name goat's rue now. I think it's in the parsley family that's now causing problems up in northern Pennsylvania and New York. So we'll stick with Tephrosia, which is a very pretty name. This is a nice plant of barren soils and stuff. So if you look at this flower, when we talked about all of the parts, sexual parts, the style and the pistil with the style at the end and the anthers, you can't see them here. So where are they? This is a non-native flower, but it's a little easier to see. Scotch broom in the pea family. Where are the style and the pistil? Well, they're all hidden here in this keel petal, the center boat-shaped petal here in the center. And when a bee that's heavy enough lands on here, the anthers and the pistil pop up out and hit it in the belly. So here's the anthers, and this long one is the pistil. So the next flower it lands on, if it has pollen on its belly, the next flower will get scraped by the pistil coming up and pushing down. So when a bumblebee gets covered with pollen and it cleans itself and pushes it onto its, mixes it with some nectar, puts it in its pollen baskets, the one place it can't really clean perfectly is the center of its thorax, the center of its lower side. So it's right there holding pollen ready for the next flower visitor. Now I will say, honeybees do not like to get poked in the belly with anthers and pistils. They avoid flowers that do this. So native bees and bumblebees are much better at this, which is why native bees are used for pollinating of alfalfa, where alfalfa seeds is grown out in the western US. Sunflowers, this is a non-native red clover, but I like this picture because I was really happy to get the hummingbird or the bumblebee here, the two-spotted bumblebee. But that's a fairly long-tongued, it's a medium-tongued bumblebee that can get all the way into the flower and so get nectar out of it. Honeybees can't get flower out of red clover. It flowers too deep. Our native lupin is really rare, partly because deer eat it. But Texas bluebonnets are pretty common. And up north there's lupins. But one interesting thing, so the whole flower cluster is a blue advertisement, a blue flag advertising pollination. But after a flower in the flower cluster is pollinated, these two central parts of the petals turn purple red. And the unpollinated flowers are white. So it actually steers the bee once it gets close to the flower that needs to be pollinated. It's a signal that it's still acting as a signal to bring in a pollinator, but it steers them to the flowers that need it. And I thought I had another picture. Another flower that does this very noticeably are some of our fall blooming asters, calico aster in particular. The central disc flowers are yellow when they're ready to be pollinated, when they're waiting. Once they're pollinated, they turn pinkish red. So it's doing the same thing, sending a signal. So this is our state flower, mountain laurel, Calmia latifolia. This is a wild type, a nice pink one. Very interesting flower. It's in the azalea rhododendron family. It has 10 anthers with 10 stamens, or 10 stamens with 10 anthers. So the anthers are these brown spots at the end. And they're, as the flower forms, they're tucked in these little pockets in the back of the flower. And as the flower opens, those stamens are bent back and held down. And they're essentially spring-loaded, waiting for a pollinator. So there's the 10 stamens, and then here's the pistil right in the center, waiting to be pollinated. As I mentioned before, the European honeybees don't like being whacked by flower parts, and this plant does that very well. So here, this is a cultivar of mountain laurel, but you can see the same thing. Nice 10 anthers all tucked in here, ready to go. You can test this yourself. I do it with like a pine needle or a tiny twig. You can touch these and the anthers will pop out of that little pocket and fling forward, and you'll see a little white pollen grain fly through the air, catapulted. If there were a bee here, it would get whacked and the pollen would be stuck to the bee. So only bumblebees really will tolerate this insult and do a pollination job on our mountain laurel. And here's a flower, that same flower before or after I poked it with a pine needle and got some of the anthers this spring. So this one is only partly loaded now. A similar flower is the bog Calmia angustifolia bog laurel. Is it bog laurel? Sheep laurel. And here's a bog butterfly, and you can see with the long proboscis, it can stand by and not get whacked and not do any pollination. So it's not doing a job. This is a nice little laurel it's good for poor soils or wet soils, good sandy soils, or even boggy soils. Great little plant. Same shape flower, just pink. So in general, bees do better pollination because they really get in there and are trying to collect the pollen. The only butterfly that I know of that eats pollen is not around here, but in the southern United States, if you go on vacation, the zebra longwing is actually able to digest pollen, give out some saliva from its proboscis and digest pollen. And that's a very long-lived butterfly, can live over 6 months and do flying around the whole time. All right, now we're going to get to what I think some people have been waiting for, milkweeds. The pollination of milkweeds. How do they do this? Most people, and exactly what I thought was pollination, all you had to do to pollinate a flower was take a little paintbrush and poke it around in a flower and stir it around and move it to the next flower and you would do it. Well, milkweeds don't do that. That doesn't work with them. They need to have an insect that gets in there and does some special things. But milkweeds are very popular with nectar feeding insects, but not many things eat the pollen, and you'll see why in a second. So this is a close-up of a milkweed flower that I took. This is common milkweed. And the area inside the dotted circle is the important part. So the structure of a milkweed flower is there's a central column, which is where the stamens, the anthers, and the pistils are. I'll talk about them in a second. And then go back. Then there's the hoods and horns, which are the petals. So there's a hood and this horn that sticks out. And their main function is to steer the leg of a visiting insect into the slot in between. And you may notice there's this little black dot right here. And then there's a slit in the flower right here. And that's what we're going to be looking at. So if you look, you'll see that come out. So when an insect comes in here, if its foot gets in the bottom of this slot, it's serrated. It can't pull its foot down. It can only pull it up. And as it does, it pulls it up and this whole thing comes out. This is called a translator. That's one name. That's the black dot, and connected to it are two pollinia, clumps of pollen that are in sacs. And they're flat and wing-like and yellow like this. And they clip together like a clothespin on the insect's leg. Or if it's unfortunate, they can get clipped onto its mouth parts and antenna and other things you'll see sometimes. But that contains all the pollen. And so as it's carried and it dries a little, they tend to twist. So they're ready to be inserted again, and they have to go in that slot on another flower. So here's the milkweed flower. This one on the left is the pollinia are still in place, the translator's there, and this one's empty. This one's been removed. And so if that pollinia gets in that slit, it gets locked in there, and then the pollen grains will germinate and go in and pollinate the flower and produce the embryos. So here's one. I did this manually. This is a non-bee one, but I got one of them in. It's apparently easier for a bee than it was for me, but you can see a couple others here ready for pollinia to get in. So Dr. Tatiana Lipschultz at the Academy of Natural Science in Philadelphia is the one that really told me about this. I knew the Asclepiads, this family, had things like this, but I didn't know the details of ours. Her research at the Academy involves looking at old specimens of milkweed, and you can still see whether they were pollinated or not, or the pollinia were removed and if pollen was inserted, even after 100 or 150 years on a herbarium specimen. So what she's doing is comparing old pollination rates to new pollination rates to see how the ecology has changed over time. It's fascinating. If you ever want to learn more, she's a great resource, Dr. Tatiana Lipschultz. All of the milkweeds have the same basic flower structure. So swamp milkweed, same flower structure, but much smaller flowers. So it tends to only small insects can really get their feet in. I don't think this Baltimore butterfly could really pollinate this swamp milkweed. I think its legs are too big to fit in the slots. Little butterflies like this hair streak, this banded hair streak on butterfly milkweed, is actually some insects are small enough that they can get stuck in the flower and die. Sometimes you'll find an insect hanging dead by a leg. You know, its leg gets stuck in the flower and it can't actually do the pollination. So there's a right size for pollinating most of the milkweeds. So, and all the other milkweeds, purple milkweed and the others are very similar. So the milkweeds, let me go back. The milkweed pollination, according to Dr. Lifschultz, is one of the most efficient transfers of pollen. Over almost 20% of the pollen ends up where the plant wants it, on another flower. It's very efficient. It's good for patchy plants that are spread out like milkweed. The only plants that are more efficient in pollination are the orchids, some of the orchids. So pink lady slipper is one that, both are lady slippers, common ones, the yellow and the pink, may be having trouble because of lack of pollinators. They can be hand pollinated. I know how to do that now, thanks to Dr. Peter Zale at Longwood Gardens. But the orchids and most orchids provide no reward. It's all false advertising. So a bumblebee, usually a large bee, usually a bumblebee, not a big bumblebee though, comes in this slot. There's an opening in the back, and then like a fish trap, it can't get back out. It's only a one-way in. A flight up here, and to get out, it has to climb out here. And instead of having he's not being the smartest. So and do it again at the next scrape that pollen off, which is right in there, and pollen the flower. So there's no reward. It's all a decoy. But you think, well, this isn't very efficient. It does get a good target. But think about orchids like this can live decades, if not multiple decades long. So they only, and an orchid seed pod will have thousands of seeds, and they're tiny. They're very tiny seeds. So it only really has to produce a seed pod once or twice in its life, maybe, to keep the population going. It doesn't need to be pollinated every year. And the yellow lady slipper is very similar in its need, except the bumblebee goes down in here and comes out, and you can see that one of the exit holes, the bee has to either come out this side or there's a catching one on the other side to do the pollination. And this one looks like it may over pollinated. Here you can see the ovary looks like it's swelling a little bit already to produce the seed pod there at the back of the flower. This is one of my favorites because this is even more of a joke on the insect. So the grass pink orchid is found in bogs in northern Pennsylvania, and especially you see that pretty easily in bogs in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. This is actually, well, let me go back to the lady slipper for a second. So in most orchids, as what we consider the lower petal here is actually the upper petal. The flower turns 180 degrees and makes the upper petal the lower petal. It's a term called resupination. And most orchids do that, but the grass pink orchid doesn't do that. Its upper petal stays upper. And so this is the true upper petal. And you see these nice yellow anther looking things up at the top, looks like stamens up here. That's a decoy. There is no neck, no pollen there, nothing. All of the pollinia and the pistil are down here in this arm that sticks out at the bottom, this pink arm that's sort of hard to see on that flower. You can see it a little bit on this flower. And this upper petal is very weakly attached. It's flexible. So when a bee lands on that, it actually falls backwards and hits its head down here and gets the pollinia on it. And then it goes to the next flower, grabs this decoy, and does it again. So it's a real bait and switch. It's sort of a practical joke, but it works. This plant gets pollinated very well. When you see it later in the season, there's usually seeds forming in all of them. So another favorite thing of mine is this. So does everyone recognize this plant? Usually if I have an audience in front of me, I can have people raise their hands. But this is a tomato flower. Now, if you look at it closely, do you see any stamens and pistils? Do you see any pollen, any parts? No, it's all hidden in a stiff cone in the center. And the anthers are in there, and they only release the pollen when an insect shakes the flower. It's called vibratory pollination or buzz pollination. So tomatoes are a buzz pollinated flower. Honeybees do not know how to buzz pollinate. They don't do that. At least they don't do that to our native plants. Maybe they do it to some European plants. They don't do it to ours. So we have a number of native buzz pollinated plants, quite a few of them actually. This is one, partridge pea, Hemicrysta fasciculata. And if you look at the flower up close, this is what it looks like. You can see there's these long tubular stamens that have a hole at the end called porocidal. There's a pore at the end that the pollen can come out. And even on this plant, there's two long stamens and 3 or 4 or 5 short ones. I'm not sure. And then there's a pistil in there somewhere too. So when the bee lands and buzzes, it vibrates and it shakes some of the pollen out. And the pollen hits the bee. And in this case, the pollen, some of it hits the bee's face and some of it hits the bee's mouth. So it's spreading its pollen out around the bee, providing some for food and some for pollination. This is plant I have most in my yard, wild senna, Hebe is the one I have. And the flower has brown stamens here, anthers at the end of the stamen, so you can see it pores at the end. And there's some here too, short ones, just like the partridge pea. And then the green pistil with the stigma at the end right here in the center. So that's a side view. We look at a bee's front view as it approaches the flower. It's got these two big curved anthers here at the bottom, pistil right here in the center with some white fuzz on it. The short anthers here in the center, and then these brown bits here are decoys. They're just to make it a flag, a signal that it's more attractive. But you can see the two little pores at the end of these makes them look sort of like little pig snouts that the pollen lands. So bee comes in, lands on here, and vibrates the flower. And they do that, they can somehow, and I still haven't found an entomologist that tells me how they do this. They can take their thorax muscles, which usually vibrate the wings, and vibrate their thorax without flying, without moving their wings. And they buzz to get the pollen out. And it hits them and they clean it off, but they can't clean the center of their thorax, their belly, as they come into the next flower and they pollinate the flower. Some researchers at Penn State have studied the pollen of wild senna, and they found it has a very preferred ratio of protein to lipids, to fats in for the diet. It's a perfect diet for baby bumblebees, apparently. They highly prefer this flower. The only bumblebee species I've seen pollinate this around here are the common eastern bumblebee and the two-spotted bumblebee. I don't know if any of the others do. Brown-belted doesn't seem to go to this flower and do that on this flower. But I don't know if any of our other bumblebees do that, but those are some of our most common ones. So here's a close-up again, side view. You can see the pistil in the center ready to catch the pollen that's in the center of the next bee that visits. This pollen is so good. The bees basically have the flowers cleaned out by about 10 in the morning. I've gone out to try to get pollen to look at it under a microscope, and I have to get out there early for there to be any pollen left. Every day, a new flowers open in the cluster, and the bees clean them out. So The flowers, what researchers have found is the flower, you'd think a bee would come in and it would have the perfect buzz to get all the pollen out. Well, they don't. They're actually mistuned. Flower doesn't want to give all its pollen to the first bee to visit. They want to spread it out for a better chance of pollination. So the ideal frequency to get the pollen out isn't the frequency that the bees vibrate at. Probably if the bees get better at pollinating, size of the anthers will vary a little, so it still will stay not efficient. Apparently that's a survival thing. So in my yard, we're on a state highway, so I have to get up early and go out before there's traffic. But this is a video I took with my little handheld camera a few years ago of a common eastern bumblebee worker coming to wild senna in my yard. So here we go. And so after she's got a load of as much pollen as she can get for one start, she'll go sit somewhere in a neighborhood plant, scrape it all off, mix it with a little or nectar, and make it into a paste that she packs in her pollen baskets, and then go back and do other flowers. And they're very busy and they love it, and I love watching them. All right. So another flower, native flower that does the same thing, has the same thing as horse nettles. Solanum caroliniense. In this case, though, you can't really hear it because I was standing further away with a longer lens camera, but you can see she's grabbing each of the 5 banana-shaped anthers and shaking them. And she's got a good load of pollen in her pollen baskets already here. You can tell if a bee has visited this flower. If you look at the anthers, those yellow anthers in the center, you can see the bruises the bee makes by grabbing them with their jaws while she buzzes. They really hold on to them enough to do a job. So we do have other buzz pollinated plants. The native cranberry, Vaccinium macrocarpum, is buzz pollinating. You can see the similarity in shape to the flower to a tomato. The native shooting stars are buzz pollinated. In fact, the buzz pollination may be the reason botanists now consider shooting stars to actually be a primrose, primula species. They're a branch of primroses from the center of the tree that specialized in getting buzz pollinated in the Western United States. So primulas are circumpolar. They grow from Europe all the way across Asia and through North America. But in North America, some of them became specialized for buzz pollinated, like our shooting stars. And so that bee has to get in there and shake them to get the pollen out of that cone-shaped flower. A really weird one, you've probably all seen spotted wintergreen Chimaphila maculata. And no, don't ask me what's spotted about and why it's not called striped wintergreen. I don't know the answer to that question. But if you look at the flower, the anthers are these odd 2 tube things with the holes in, sort of like a bizarre shower head. Oops, I thought I had a close-up picture. And when a bumblebee comes and visits this flower, what it does is as it's hanging down, the bumblebee grabs the whole thing. It's funny to watch. And it just buzzes and the pollen all falls out onto the bee as the bee's hanging under the flower and catching it like a basket held under the flower. You may not know it, but most roses, all our native roses, are buzz pollinated. Flowers produce no nectar. The anthers are sort of closed and a bee has to get in there and vibrate it in order to get the pollen out. Now, when they do that, some of the pollen falls on the flower because the flower's up facing in this case. So some of the flower pollen will fall around and then other insects will come get some of the leftovers, like this longhorn beetle is doing here on the Carolina rose, Rosa caroliniana. Okay, beard tongues. These are some of my really favorites. They're not Well, maybe they are buzz pollen, but anyway. So the first thing you notice if you look at a beard tongue flower, a common one, Penstemon digitalis, has these really hairs with sticky dewdrops all over the outside. They're a protection of the flower. You can see a couple little gnats stuck here. They've tried to get to the flower, and it's basically flypaper. It's to keep out ants and other insects that won't do a pollination and keep them from stealing nectar or pollen from the flower. So that's the side view of the beard tongue. If you look at the front view here on the left, so we've got some guidelines, some landing lines showing here a place for the insect to go. Here we have a decoy. It's called the staminode. In this case, it looks like it's got some pollen on it, some anthers, but that's a complete false advertising thing too. There's no pollen there. But there's 4 stamens with these black anthers up in the roof of the flower. The anthers come up and curl over. So that's how the plant gets its name. It's got 4 stamens, and it's got one here that's almost a stamen, which means penstemon means almost a stamen. Just like a peninsula is almost an island. It's not penstemon, meaning 5, because it doesn't have 5. It's penstemon, meaning almost. All right, enough of the pedantry. So when a bee wants nectar, it'll come in here, go to the back, stick her proboscis in there, and get nectar out of this narrow slot in the nectary in the back. So a flower like this that's open is called chasmogamous. It's like a chasm. And if it's big enough for the insect to get all the way in, it's called vestibular. It has a vestibule that the insect can get all the way in. So you can see how this is big enough for a bumblebee to get in pretty far. And up close, you can see we've got our pistil and the anthers here, and a bee gets nectar, will get pollen on its back. So ordinary insects like butterflies, like this long-dash skipper, hangs on the outside, isn't going to do much of a job pollinating. But bumblebees will go all the way in, go from flower to flower, stick their head all the way in to get the nectar. But I discovered, well, other people knew, but I first noticed this a number of years ago. I was watching a bumblebee in my yard, and it was going in the flowers upside down. And at first I thought I had a drunk bumblebee, but every flower it would go in and go upside down. And what I found by reading was that if it's a female bumblebee that wants to get pollen, it'll go in upside down, buzz, and get the pollen to fall down onto its belly and collect it that way. If it's a female that just wants nectar, or if it's a male, they'll go in the beard tongue flower right side up. And it's fun to watch. I don't have good video of one going from flower to flower, but they do it. They'll just go into each flower and turn upside down as they go. Another native penstemon is this one, which stays closed. Penstemon hirsutus is a little less common. It likes rocky, dry slopes. But only insects that know what to do can get in. So here's a leafcutter bee. I actually got this picture of the bee backing out and then flying away. But they know enough to go in, just like the bee I showed you going into the gentian last week. They know enough to go in, push in, and that keeps out small flies and insects that wouldn't do a good job pollinating. So it's very similar to the snapdragon family that I mentioned before. So I want to look, as I finish up here, at a pollination syndrome. We don't have too many obvious ones around here compared to some other places like South Africa, but we have a whole lot of plants that are adapted for pollination by hummingbirds that are pretty easy to talk about, look at. So red flowers that are tubular with no perch for insects, so only a hovering hummingbird can do the job, like this at Monarda didyma, ebalm, and the female ruby-throated hummingbird. So if you look closely at the flowers, like here on the left, you can see the stamens are halfway out and then the pistils longer. So when a hummingbird gets in to get nectar, it's going to get this pollen on its forehead, and it goes to the next flower, it hopefully will leave some of it behind. Now, hummingbirds don't particularly like to get their face full of pollen. So if they can, they'll get in and out without it. So if they're doing it too much, deeper flowers will be selected for, and over time they can get longer. And that's how, when an orchid was discovered in Madagascar back in the 1800s, and a specimen was sent back to England, and Charles Darwin saw it, flower of this orchid was 12 inches deep. And he said, somewhere in Madagascar there in that area, there's going to be a moth with a 12-inch long proboscis. And it was found about 100 years later that he was right. So there's competition, the whole thing. So just for comparison, here's another Monarda, Monarda fistulosa, and you can see it has a landing platform for insects. So it's more bee pollinated, and butterflies visit it a lot too. But it doesn't have the red color. So butterflies like this silver spotted skipper and hummingbird moths. And the hummingbird moths are fun to watch because they can hover at the flower. And as they do, they hold the flower or control their distance with 1 or 2 feet. This is missing one of its front feet. So he only has 1 foot on as a one front leg, but they usually have 2 that they touch the flower and bounce around. Here's a slow motion bit. But it's funny, I don't see these visiting the red bee balm. I only see them in Monarda fistulosa much. I'll have to watch the bee balm more. Maybe they're around. If anyone knows, if you see these visit either of the common species, this is the hummingbird moth. The other one is the snowberry clearwing moth. The caterpillars of both these feed on things in the honeysuckle family. So even though they don't need a perch, hummingbirds can be lazy and perch if they can. They don't want to waste the energy if they don't have to, which is why they often perch when they come to feeders. But bumblebees can pollinate and visit Monarda, and the long-tongue species or medium tongue, this is a 2-spotted bumblebee, can do the job. She's getting right in there and doing a good job of visiting. I think she's too short to pollinate it though. So other things with the red tubular flowers around here just started blooming now in my yard, wild columbine. Fire pink, which is native to just into southern Virginia or northern North Carolina, is a very good hummingbird plant that our hummingbirds very much know what to do with. Cardinal flower is well known as a hummingbird plant. You can see it's got the pistil up here and the anthers in here. And when a hummingbird gets in, it's going to get this white pollen on the back of its head. And one thing I want to mention here, I mentioned earlier, a lot of insects, or most plants, are honest, but there's some populations of cardinal flower out in Arizona that are red but produce no nectar. The insects learn elsewhere, migrant hummingbirds learn elsewhere about cardinal flower, and when they come through Arizona, they think, oh, I'll stop for a snack, and the plant doesn't have to waste the energy of producing nectar. They take advantage of hummingbirds having learned about nectar elsewhere, and they fool them. They're faking it. The Eastern Indian paintbrush, which is now maybe gone from Pennsylvania. This was at Craven's Meadow, Full Shock Lake Preserve a few years ago, is a hummingbird pollinated plant, or only Eastern paintbrush. They're pretty common species out west. Neat flowers. I hope we can find them. And of course, trumpet honeysuckles, which many of you know, no perches. If you look at it from the front, from a hummingbird's point of view, This is the pistil. These are the stamens with the anthers. The hummingbird wants to get in there. It's going to get this yellow pollen all over its forehead and get it onto the next flower. Small red morning glory is another one. This is actually native either to the southern United States or possibly some people think even South America, but it's spread this far north. The seeds I grow in my garden originally came from South Jersey. If you see a hummingbird with white pollen on it in the summer in my yard, it's because of the small red morning glory. Standing cypress is one of my favorite plants, SEPA rubra. It's native to the southeastern US and the Midwest as far north as Michigan, but not the east. But our hummingbirds perfectly know what to do with it. It's a great plant, nice deep flowers, good for hummingbirds. But if you watch it, which I've done a few years, it's an annual, a winter annual, or sometimes a summer annual. Bumblebees visit it, but they do nectar robbing, and so do carpenter bees on it. So their tongue is no way long enough to get the nectar out, but they go to the base of the flower tube, bite a hole through it, and steal the nectar out without doing any pollination. So that's called nectar robbing. So I was watching that, and I knew that. And then I noticed a few years later, some butterflies that have learned to go to the holes that the bees already made, because they can't bite a hole, but they go to the holes that the bees have made, and they're a secondary nectar robbing. They don't do the primary job of making the hole, but they go and sip some nectar after the hole has been made. So it's like someone coming in after a bank robber and grabbing a little cash. So that was a summer azure. This is a gray hair streak doing that. And I've also seen eastern tail blues and I think one other butterfly do that on that. So what does a plant do? Well, for most plants like the Ipomopsis, flowers are basically disposable. They don't last long. They don't invest a super amount of energy in any one flower in building it for the plant. And that's why a lot of caterpillars eat flowers. There's like a number that's specialized at eating dogwood flowers and eating blueberry flowers, for example, because plants don't put defensive chemicals in the flowers like they do for the leaves. So the flowers are a safer and easier snack for the caterpillars. But some plants decide to defend the flowers. So in trumpet creeper, it's sort of bee theft proof. The flowers, if you ever feel it, the corolla tube is really thick and spongy, and a bee can't bite through it and steal the nectar. It has to be a long-beaked hummingbird that gets in there. And by the way, I don't recommend anyone plant campsis anywhere near your house. I can tell you that from personal experience. It isn't the favorite hummingbird plant anyway. So if you want to think like a bee or butterfly and what you would want to do for grocery shopping, and you want to make something good for birds, you want to make sure that they'll be able to see it and find the plants, and you want to have a big enough clump and good quality plants and a variety. One thing is probably can be enough for a given plant. So diversity is what you're after. So if you want to garden for pollinators, there's a number of good books I'll talk about quick in a second. But what you want to think about is if you're going to garden centers, plant breeders are going for appearance. They're not going for pollination or providing for leaves for insects to eat. They don't care about that. Like I said last week, it may or may not be good to have cultivars. For cultivars, if you can see the pollen, if you see one thing I've taken to doing in the past couple years in the summer is going to garden centers that have outdoor displays and seeing what the bees are visiting there to see if it's a cultivar that's good, that is appreciated by the local bees. You want to generally avoid hybrids. So the hybrids, for example, between the blue lobelia, Lobelia syphilitica, and the cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis, can be very pretty flowers, but they're generally not very good for pollinators. The insects don't find them, or they don't produce much pollen. So in general, you want to avoid hybrids that look different from the parents. And the orange and yellow echinaceas fall into that category now. One website that has some good information, I don't think, no matter how much current research she's doing, but pollinatorgardens.org of Annie White up in Vermont has some good information. And Mount Cuba has been doing a lot. They've got some trials going on. So they are going to be putting out stuff. Why did it advance? Go back. And one more thing, when you visit nurseries and do some observation, make sure that they're not putting neonicotinoid pesticides on the plants, that they're butterfly, caterpillar, bee safe plants. Some big box stores have started switching a couple years ago. I don't know what their current status is, but you should ask them if people at a big box store don't know. You could probably find a website that will tell what their official policy is. But if even the seeds were treated with the pesticides, it can kill the insects. A friend of ours at the North Museum in Lancaster did an exhibit a number of years ago where she put in native plants and got a bunch of caterpillars, and the plants were donated by a garden center, and all the caterpillars died. The plants had apparently been treated with systemic insecticides. And you can always share your good pollinator plants with your friends. So some books, I'll just go through this quick so you can look at the recording later. If you want to read generally about bees, these are both good books. I think I like Thor Hansen's Buzz a little bit better, but Paige Emberley's Our Native Bees is pretty good. I started getting interested in pollination and learning about it with this book, Natural History of Pollination, which is worldwide, but the authors are British. So it didn't apply to our species as much as I would have liked. I just got these two books this year from a sale at Princeton Publishing. So this is on my reading list for the summer after it gets too hot to work outside, or next winter. Read some of this pollination ecology. Information about bumblebees. Here's a couple good books. Bumblebee Economics, I mentioned before. This Natural History of Bumblebees is pretty good. If you really want to get into bumblebees, the central one is the one to look at, but it's got all of North America, which gets sort of confusing. A lot of plant books. Here's the Xerxes Society, has a lot of good books. That's our only organization dedicated to the preservation and restoration of invertebrates, which is cool. Heather Holm has some great books. She's out of Minnesota, good information about pollinators and bees, and now wasps, gardening, and so forth. You want, particularly so many people like monarchs, this Monarchs and Milkweed book is very interesting. Basically, he says, from all the research, monarchs are basically pests and parasites on milkweed. Milkweed doesn't get any advantage from being eaten. Native plant gardening books. There's a number of good butterfly identification books. I like the Butterflies of Pennsylvania by David Wright and Dr. Monroe. The actual Butterflies of Indiana is surprisingly a very good book for Pennsylvania. We have a very similar butterfly flora, and it's a very good book too. The difference between the two is the Butterflies of Indiana has pictures, photographs arranged digitally, so the butterflies are lined up, so they're in natural lifestyle. In the Butterflies of Pennsylvania, David and James have made it so that it's pin specimens, which I find a little harder to look at for the most part, although they do have some native photographs for ID of skippers and stuff. So, but I like having both books. There's a number of books about bees. Bees are really hard to identify. If you want to learn more about identifying bees, talk to me later. For the ecology of bees, if you want to read about the ecology of solitary bees, the Brian Danforth's book, this is a thick scientific one. It's a great book, my favorite now. Can identify caterpillars and moths, with a lot of books, and talk more about that. And that's the end.
Mike, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I'm sure that my dogs are gonna fight here in a second. That's what I'm sure of. I'm sure that we have some questions. Nobody put them in the chat. If you want to unmute, feel free to unmute and ask Mike any questions. I know that was so much to absorb. And
Yeah, it's
Right.
way
Well,
too much,
fascinating.
but you can watch the recording later.
yes, I will, and take lots of notes. Thankfully, Susan takes amazing notes, so she'll do a really great summary, I'm sure.
That was fascinating. Excuse me, Jesse.
No, go ahead.
Like the photograph you had of the Baltimore checker spot on Asclepius, I believe it was.
Yep,
Did you take that photograph? And if so, where was that located?
I took all those photographs.
So
There's
where did
every
you catch-
photograph in that.
where
That one. Let's see, where was that one? I think that one was up in northern Berks County near Hawk Mountain on some private land, which is that wet meadow has now been turned into a sheep pasture.
Oh, no.
But there are some other wet meadows in that area that have Baltimore checker spots, and there's some out at Fort Indian Town Gap. Not in the parts that are open to the public on their tour days, though. None of
Mhm.
it's really open to the public.
Is
all
there
the time,
anything nearby Lancaster that you have seen?
I have not seen Baltimore checker spots in Lancaster, no.
They
No,
need a
I
specific.
don't know.
a
Oh, no, I lied. They're at Middle Creek.
Oh, they are. Okay.
Yeah, the place I've seen them is back on the tour, off the tour road. There's that one little road goes back to a cul-de-sac,
Mm-hmm.
Branches off, goes up over a hill to a cul-de-sac. Back in that area is where I've seen Baltimore
they-
checker spots.
They need Chelone glabra as their host plant, right?
Yeah, and I read somewhere once that the pink chelone from the southern US is actually poisonous to the caterpillars. But
Wow.
I cannot find that reference again. So if anyone comes across that, let me know.
Wow.
I'd like to be able to say that for sure, but I
Right.
know
good
the
to
white turtlehead, the white chelone is definitely what they like. That's in the fall. They're an interesting butterfly that overwinters as a caterpillar, a middle-aged caterpillar. So they hatch in the fall, they feed on the turtlehead, the chelone. And then in the spring, they'll feed on the chelone and also on other things. They'll go to a lot of other trees and shrubs in the spring. They aren't as dependent. And up in New England, they've actually made the jump in some populations. There's a new host race of Baltimore's that will feed on English plantain in the fall,
Hmm.
which is
Fascinating.
pretty interesting. I saw Dan Behringer put up in the chat that he has some Baltimore checker spots at one of their preserves. I couldn't read which one it was. Was it Crow's Nest? Yeah. They have some at Crow's Nest there in northern Chester County.
That's awesome, Dan. We were
Which-
talking about coming to Crow's Nest, having a chapter meetup there. So maybe we can put that on our list of things to do and look for checker spots.
So you want to do that from my experience, they're mostly flying in early to mid-July.
Sounds like a date. Awesome.
The other thing that people get mistaken, they're not a huge butterfly. They're pretty medium, small butterfly. People see all the close-up pictures and think it's going to be the size of a monarch, and they're not. And when they're flying, they actually look just like a dark little inconspicuous butterfly. They're not at all obvious until you're familiar with them. They're cool little butterflies. They're just amazing, those wing patterns. The turtle head that you mentioned, now that you say, is also like the beard tongues. It's a cousin. Bees have to force their way in, and they turn upside down if they want pollen, or if they're going for nectar, they go in right side up. And they go all the way into and disappear in that flower.
Yeah. Yeah, I've witnessed that. That's a lot of fun to watch. Awesome, Mike. Thank you so much. I'm gonna, if everybody has their questions answered for now, they're probably gonna have tons of questions after they get to review the recording, but I'll pass along anything they pass to me in case there are questions later. I'm gonna bring
Okay.
this back up. Okay, so let's go into here. We talked a little bit about earlier that the thought of the month was going to be about identifying native plants in spring, and Audrey's going to help me out with some of this. I might have lost Audrey, so let me.
I'm good. Sorry, Jesse.
Oh, no problem.
I thought you were going to continue for a second there. Okay, thank you. Mike is a very hard act to follow. So, all right. So this month's going to be a little more freeform than the typical, I write something and then nervously read it. We're going to have a little more of a discussion here that I hope you guys will participate in. So I wasn't quite sure what to do for this month's thought of the month. And Jesse said, hey, we're having the plant swap. So why don't we try and help people identify the natives that they have as they're coming up in the spring? So I started to do some research on that and found it pretty difficult to find anything definitive, in one place. So there was one article that Jesse sent me, and that was what Grow It, Build It, Jesse, was the website. And we'll talk about that again a little bit later. But other than that, like I said, I couldn't find all that much. So I'm not saying it's not out there. I just couldn't find it. So my little bit here is very citizen scientist. And at the end of it, you might just all say, well, thank you, Captain Obvious. And maybe you'll have some better ideas. But these are the plants that I've been seeing near me. And like my process for trying to figure out what I was looking at. So I think, those of us that love natives, we either look at, these plants that come up and say, oh my gosh, look at that, it's a bloodroot, like I did with this one, because I was familiar with this plant. Or you're like, oh my gosh, what is that? So I'm going to just kind of take you through these few plants that I've either known what they are, tried to identify, and some ways that might help you guys. So Jesse, let's see if we can go. I'm working on the other computer as well, trying to look at the speaker notes. So bear with me here.
No problem. So one of the characteristics that makes bloodroot easy to identify even before it blooms, because you may miss the bloom. The flowers are only there for a day, but it has those really oddly shaped lobed petals, and they are there before the flowers. You can see it here in the middle picture a bit, but that is an indicator like, hey, I might want to check this patch every day to see if the flowers are going to pop up.
Yeah, and where I am, there is just a carpet of them right now. They're just beautiful. So obviously with this one, it was the flower that caught my eye. And I also love, you can see the bottom left picture and even the top left, but when the leaves are new like that, they just hug the stem. And I don't have a great picture of them fully open, unfortunately, but they just look so neat, like just hugging that stem like that. So that's another way that you can identify them. But so for observation, just overview, what stands out about the plant? Is it flower color, like in the bloodroot? Then what month are you looking at it? Does it flower in that month? Does it have an interesting leaf shape, color, or pattern? Where's the plant growing? Is it in a wet area? For instance, near me now, there are marsh marigolds. And I thought to look for them or look them up to ID them because they're in a swampy sort of area. Is it shady? Is it sunny? Is it rocky? Pull knowledge from, what you already know. And Jesse, if you want to go to the next slide, an example. Yeah, go ahead. An example of that is wild ginger, Asarum canadense. I knew that this plant had heart-shaped leaves, and when I saw this, I thought that that's what it might be. Then I knew also that it had this cool little reddish brown flower that grew very close to the soil. So, I parted the leaves on some, and sure enough, there it was. So that's another way. Okay, and then go ahead, Jesse. The next one is Appalachian stonecrop, Sedum glaucophyllum. And this one I saw on a rock, which you can see there, some moss while I was hiking. And I knew it was a sedum because it's succulent. And I initially thought Allegheny stonecrop, but I didn't recall those little like florets that the leaves make. So I started looking up different sedums, and I started asking people, and eventually somewhere online I found this one, and was able to positively identify it. Okay, and next one, there we go. May apples, Podophyllum peltatum. These also I was familiar with, and I have a cool little story. I've been friends with somebody for about 15 years now, and probably about 10 years ago, I went to my first native plant sale, and I bought, I think it was 3 May apples. Well, I gave my friend one, I planted the other 2. Mine died, hers thrived, and continue to thrive to this day. Well, I just met her last week, met up with her, and she brought me a beautiful pot with 2 May apples in it. They are from the original plant that I gave her over 10 years ago. So I'm hoping I don't kill these guys. They're so beautiful. So I was familiar with this plant, but you can see here, obviously, the leaves look like little umbrellas when they're fully opened. And the flowering plants have a white flower, which will form fruit on plants with 2 stems and 2 leaves. And the fully ripe fruit is edible, though all other parts of the plant are said to be toxic. And another name for Mayapple is American mandrake. And if you're fans of Harry Potter, you'll recall it from that. Okay, and the next one.
I have just a little thing to share about May apples. Also, the bottom left picture is when they're first emerging out of the soil. They're very pokey and they're fun to try and spot because they come out of the ground just over a few days. It seems to take them to, come all the way up and out. And then it looks like a little Smurf village or something. Like they're just so cute. But I got the May apples that I have on my property because I responded to somebody on, I don't know if it was Facebook or Nextdoor. It was some group that I was a part of, and they said, hey, we're putting in a patio, but it's going to pave over all of these May apples if anybody wants to come and dig some up. So my daughter and I went on a rescue mission to go get some May apples, and I was amazed at the huge, extensive, long, thick roots that these dainty little plants had. So we just kind of like excavated whatever we could. We were throwing them in cardboard boxes, and I think every single one of them has just thrived here. So they transplant very well, have to say.
Can I add something about May apples quick?
Please.
Yes, please.
The not sure what pollinates that. Some people have speculated that the pollinator of May apples might be extinct. Some clones, and every big patch you see in the woods is probably all one clone connected by those big roots you talked about. And some clones produce a lot of fruit and some almost never produce any fruit. They may be self-fertile, those ones that produce fruit. I've rarely seen an insect. It might be a bumblebee, but some people have speculated it's in a whatever bee it was that really pollinated well might be gone. So what I'd ask is,
turtles spread them, don't they?
well, they spread the seeds. They eat the
But
fruit
not
and
the
spread the
pollinate-
seeds, but
yeah.
they don't pollinate it.
Ah,
So the question is, what I'm asking, if anyone sees something pollinating or any insect visiting a mayapple, try to get pictures and put them up on iNaturalist and
Okay.
let me know. I'm curious. With this many eyes looking closely at mayapples, maybe someone will spot it.
Good project.
Yep.
Yeah.
We'll have homework. Awesome.
That's interesting because I did
Yeah.
read that you should plant other flowering plants nearby to increase the odds that they might be pollinated.
Yeah, I've heard that too. I'd be interested to know if that works. I have a bunch of clones in my yard, and there's one that produces fruit all the time. And there's a couple others that only produce fruit if I pollinate them. And they're easy to pollinate when the stigma at the end of the pistil is receptive. It's sticky. When you touch it with your finger, it's like flypaper. Your fingers or weak flypaper, it sticks. So then you can put pollen on it really easily. It's easy to pollinate them then. But there's several that only get fruit if I pollinate them. And then there's one that gets fruit all the time.
Wow.
That's interesting.
So cool plant, I agree.
Very
Yeah,
cool plant.
it's super cool.
Um,
This next one, cut leaf toothwort, Cardamine concatenata, is a spring ephemeral herb with leaves similar in appearance to cannabis. And that is what initially caught my eye. And I asked a whole bunch of people and nobody knew what it was. It's all over the place here. And the interesting thing is that I sent a picture of something else to a friend to see if she could identify the main thing in the picture. And she said, I don't know what that is, but that other thing is cut leaf toothwort. So that's how I found out what that was. And then I learned that it's a member of the mustard family and that the leaves are edible. And I tried them and they're really good. They're fresh and peppery, would be good in a salad. And they support early spring pollinating bees. And they're a host plant for the West Virginia white butterfly caterpillar.
wow.
Yep. The thing is, the West Virginia, for a butterfly to use a flower, there's a couple things that have to be taken into account. The female has to recognize it as something to lay eggs on. The caterpillar, when it hatches, has to recognize the flavor as something worth taking a bite of. And then it has to be nutritious and non-poisonous to the caterpillar. And this plant is all those. But the invasive garlic mustard, female West Virginia whites recognize that as something to lay eggs on, but it's poisonous to the caterpillars. So the West Virginia white is going extinct probably because of garlic mustard. They're no longer found in Eastern PA, and they're in trouble in Western PA and getting into West Virginia now. That butterfly's in real trouble because of garlic mustard.
Yeah, that garlic mustard is so awful. It's just everywhere.
On to happier plants though.
Yeah, so another edible here, the common blue violet, Viola sororia. Leaves and flowers are edible. And there are native yellow and white violets as well. And I just wanted to say, I realize that most of us recognize this, but don't discount these just because they're common. They're beautiful, especially en masse, and are edible and make a lovely ground cover. I had loads of these growing in my lawn that I was always trying to kill, the lawn, not the flowers, but in Phoenixville. And they just looked so beautiful just throughout the lawn, and you could set the mower high enough that you wouldn't cut the heads off of these flowers when you mowed. They're just beautiful. Heart-shaped leaves, as you can see there.
And tell anyone that doesn't want them in their lawn that they're food for the great spangled fritillary butterfly and the other fritillaries, which are in real trouble. We don't know what's going on with them, but their population in this part of the world has completely crashed in the
Crashed?
past 2 years. They crashed. They used to be one of the most common butterflies in my garden in midsummer, and the caterpillars only feed on violets. But last year I saw one great spangled fritillary, and the year before I saw one. I used to see 10 or 12 at a time in the garden before that.
Wow.
We don't know what's going on, but they feed on violets, and they feed at night, so you never see the caterpillars. They're very secretive. The females lay the eggs in the fall, the caterpillars hatch, they eat their eggshell, and then they curl up in a little bit of dead leaf and sit there as a first instar caterpillar for the whole winter. And then in the spring, they crawl to find a violet. The females scatter the eggs. They don't lay them on the violets. So if you mow too much, you may even just suck up all the little caterpillars, even if you don't cut off the violets. If you rake it up so there's no leaves for them to hide in, they won't be there. So you don't want your garden too neat. You want a patch of violets. It's just left alone if possible. A
Yeah.
lot of violets. But I wouldn't be surprised if we find out that butterfly disappears from our part of the world. I'm really worried about it. And that's one of our most gorgeous big butterflies.
Mike, do they also eat the white violet? The white
I
violet?
don't know how much, they will eat a lot of species of violets. I don't know if there's any of the native violets they won't eat. But
Just
they
my
will
white
eat a
violet.
lot of the different violets. I have as many violets as I can have in my garden. Unfortunately, I have some European ones too that were given to me and I can't eliminate at this point, but I have as many native violets as I can get. White, yellow, bunch of different blue ones.
Me too. I love violets. And when they volunteer for me, I just adjust where I'm going to put my planned plants so that I can save the violets.
Right, and then it's a good excuse to say, oh, I don't have to clean that area up. I'm leaving that for the fritillaries. That's
Yeah.
the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, we create more work for ourselves, that is for sure. Unnecessary work.
Yeah, Susan says excessive lawn care. I think that may be the problem. Yes, making things too neat. We need to convince people that what we consider neat isn't a requirement.
Yeah,
I
rethink
think
pretty,
that's a
right,
many
Jesse? We're trying
generations
to,
project. Yeah,
Exactly. Rethink pretty.
yeah, we try to spread that message as often as possible. This one here, the early blue cohosh, the picture on the left here is the one I was just talking about that I sent my friend, and she was able to identify the toothwort. But Jesse, go ahead and speak more to this one, since Jesse actually was the one who could tell me what it was.
It was purely by accident. Very recently, I had seen a post about early blue cohosh, and I was like, oh, I know what that one is now, just because I had seen it. So I know very little about it besides that. However, I have a cousin to it, the blue cohosh, that I had put in last year. So I've been eagerly awaiting it coming up, and it looks so spooky when it breaks the soil because it looks like little dead fingers reaching up to like I don't know, grab you. It's so fascinating. So the two pictures on the right are from here in Pennsylvania. I read today that the early blue cohosh blooms a couple of weeks ahead of the regular blue cohosh, and considering that Audrey is south of us, that's probably even a couple more weeks, because I'm not sure at what age the plants will bloom, but I don't think mine are close to blooming.
And it starts out all purpley like that, and then the leaves get green, and then the whole plant gets green. And then when it is green like that, you don't see the flowers anymore, because I saw some today, and they had changed from this picture. This is a cool plant.
Yeah, they're very fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Okay, plants here. Okay, again, another one that most of us know, flowering dogwood, Cornus Florida. Another spring blooming understory tree, native to eastern forests. The flowers are the greenish yellow parts, and the white and sometimes pink petals that look like flowers are called bracts. And Mike might have some more interesting info on that as far as pollinators go. He's still with us?
We'll let him jump in. He can interrupt us if he's got some good tidbits. We don't want to put him on the spot too much.
Yeah,
Bud is a favorite now. So it is in full bloom down where you are, Audrey, and it's just starting up here.
Yeah, the flowers, and you can see the heart-shaped leaves there on the right, and that's what they look like when they are newly emerging, that color, and they'll obviously get a lot bigger and greener. Flowers, heart-shaped leaves, and seed pods are edible. And this is a really good landscaping alternative to the non-native flowering plums, pears, and cherries for beautiful spring color.
And I am sure that there is a term for the zigzag pattern that young branches of red buds display. That's one of the ways that I identify it as a young plant, even if it doesn't have buds. I just don't know what that term is. But if you look at new branches, new little twigs, they are zigzagged. And then the buds are all along the branches, not just at terminals or and even on the trunks sometimes. There's also another term for that I don't remember.
Yeah, I know what that, I don't know what, I think zigzag is the only term I know for what you're describing for the branch shape, but flowering right out of the branch or the trunk is called cauliflory, is in
That's it.
cauliflower.
Yep.
There's a lot of tropical plants that do that, like cocoa does that, cacao that we get chocolate from. They get big pods right on the trunk of the tree.
Nice.
Very bizarre. Yeah. No, red buds are only one that does that. I would just add that those cultivars like forest pansy with red leaves and the others like that, Doug Talamy's research at Mount Cuba has shown that those things with red foliage are less attractive. They're not eaten by the native caterpillars, the extra anthocyanins. But the butterflies that eat red bud are pretty rare. There's some moths that do, that are more common, but the butterflies that eat it, the one hair streak, and the one, or is it an elephant? There's one little butterfly I haven't seen that does feed on redbud, but the moths do, but avoid the red-leaved ones.
Straight species for the win.
Yeah, someone's, yep. Yeah, things eat the flowers. Someone says Orioles there. That'd be cool to see. That'd make a nice picture. I haven't seen that. A lot of bees love the flowers, like you said. They're really great plant.
Here's a couple fun ones from my yard. Audrey did great research for her her pictures. Mine are just fun stuff that I'm looking at around the yard. So the big leaf aster looks so furry and fuzzy coming up, breaking its dormancy. It didn't have a basal rosette, so it's new growth now. The large flowered bellwort, Uvularia grandiflora, in the middle there is so fascinating. So first it puts up that little green pointy spike, and then a couple days later that like unfurls, and you can see the leaves. There's a term for when the stem goes through the leaf. It's like perfoliate maybe. But it almost looks like somebody took a sewing needle and took the stem and sewed the leaves down through. And then a few days after that, you can see down the bottom picture, the yellow flowers are hanging upside down and they are twisted. It's just such a fascinating plant. And though it's a spring ephemeral, it does keep its leaves as long as it's mostly shaded all summer. From my experience, mostly at Mount Cuba, they have it and it's beautiful all season. The top right picture is the really furry fuzziness of sharp-lobed hepatica. And then it just bloomed for me a couple days ago. So the bottom right picture is it in bloom, and you can see in the background, it loses a lot of that furriness to its leaves once it's bloomed. Ostrich fern there, the top left. That is, so if I'm not mistaken, a fiddlehead is anytime a fern is rolled up like that when it first comes out, but there are very few fiddleheads that are edible. Ostrich fern is one of the fiddleheads that is edible at the fiddlehead stage. Once it unfurls and is the larger fronded ostrich fern that you're used to seeing in a more mature state, it's no longer edible. In the middle is yellow trout lily. These were put in last year. Their petals, their leaves look like a trout speckling like in the sun. That's why they're called a trout lily. They take up to 7 years to produce a flower, and they won't flower until they have 2 petals. Mine are young, so I probably won't see flowers for a long time. And then Virginia bluebells, I tried to get a picture before this. I have one somewhere, I just couldn't find it. When the petals first come up out of the soil, they're very pointy and that purpley green color, and it just takes a couple, maybe a week or 10 days for them to have the flower buds that you can then see. And then down at the bottom when they're in bloom, when they're budded, they're pink, and when they open fully, they turn that beautiful blue color. Cup plant in the top left. So I tried to show you things when they're very young so that you can identify them as you're wandering around if you have babies, and so that you can pull up some of those babies to bring to the plant swap maybe. So I've had cup plant for probably 5 or 6 years, and when I first got it, people told me it's very aggressive, you know, it's going to take over, just kind of watch out for it. And it never did anything. It came back every year very reliably, beautiful, big, lovely blooms, but I wasn't finding it anywhere. It didn't even volunteer at the base. And then so last year I dug it up and divided it in 4 pieces, and it was a beast to dig up and divide. I had to jump on the shovel to break it, to break the roots up to divide them. And I put them like 3 sections in, 3 of the root sections in different areas. One, I think, in a pot for a giveaway. And then there were a couple little pieces that had broken off, and I put those in little pots. They've all thrived. So now this spring is the first year, now that I broke up that root ball and spread them around, now I'm getting all of these babies that are far from where the original plant was that I broke up. So I don't know what changed, except that I irritated the root ball, and now I've got all these babies. So that's exciting. I should have a cup plant jungle come the summertime. Top middle is cardinal flower, and that keeps the basil rosette each year. It's short-lived. I think it's a biennial, probably. It is just now, even though it's had the basil rosette just over the last couple days, is now starting to put up some good top growth. And then down at the bottom middle, Virgin's Bowers is a native clematis. It's a vining plant. It's now sending out a bunch of new shoots, and the vine. So I just put it in as plugs last year, but it vined probably 6 to 8 feet in that one season, and it is getting shoots not only from the ground but up through that whole 6 to 8 foot vine. So that is very exuberant, and it has really neat seed heads that persisted most of winter. The top right is probably the bane of a lot of people's existence, giant ragweed. It is a native plant. It is wind pollinated. It is giant. It can get like 10, 12 feet tall. It causes a lot of people to have seasonal allergies, hay fever in the late summer, fall time. But if you aren't particularly bothered by that, like seasonal allergies, and you have the space for it, I watched birds eat the seeds from giant ragweed all winter. So it was worth it, because I don't really suffer from allergies, thankfully, to be able to let that grow. Now, it sets a lot of seed, and I have a lot of volunteers. So I am, and I let it grow right above a mulch pile. So now when I spread that mulch, I have to be very diligent about identifying giant ragweed and pulling it when I need to, because it definitely is very happy. The interesting part about, even though it gets to be 10, 12 feet tall, because I think it's an annual, the root system is tiny, teeny tiny. So when it comes time to clean up those old stalks, even though I just wanted to like break it off and leave some hollow stems for nesting bees, maybe, the whole thing comes up because the roots are so shallow. So I don't know how they stay upright all winter when their roots are like 3 inches deep. But it makes for easy cleanup. And then the bottom right, a lot of you will notice there is a ton of purple dead nettle in this picture. Well, I got to have fun trying to find the scarlet bee balm that I had planted in this bed that was taken over by purple dead nettle. And it was a losing battle to try and get all of the purple dead nettle. So I really just kind of pulled it all away from the plants that I wanted to be in there. But being able to identify my plants was very important in a patch like this, where there was just a lot going on. And then a couple.
One second. I just want to interrupt for a second and say, those of us that live in the shady woods are jelly. Super jealous that you've got all this stuff that's showing already, and we've got the Packara's up and one Jacob's ladder. Everything else is like hiding under the leaves still.
Right. Well,
yeah.
But you get to make all of those critters in your leaves that I don't get to make. So there's great.
True. But so then I have a question, if I can interrupt, and then I'll stop talking after this question gets answered. In our front garden and in all of our gardens, there is probably 4 inches of leaves deep. Hence us not being able to see things. And I mean, I can't tell you what's coming up out back. I literally have no idea. When is it okay to move those leaves out of the garden so we can see what's there? Or is it never? Because someone sitting next to me will be very unhappy if he has to leave the leaves there forever.
So it's a compromise, right? Because it's your property. You want to enjoy what you can. There's no magic answer, because there are different pollinators that are emerging at different times. And some of them actually need 2 seasons to really come out fully. And depending on your methods, the more you're crunching around in your leaves, the more damage you're doing. So the standard suggestion of waiting until temperatures are above 50 degrees consistently will get you a lot of pollinators that are emerging then. Pulling your stuff out without trampling all over everything. So if you can reach in, pull it out from the edges, and then just put it to a safe place instead of shredding them or putting them in plastic,
Yeah, no, they would just go in the woods.
Yeah.
Yeah, they wouldn't go anywhere other than in the woods.
So you're
Okay,
going to do a lot of good if you can wait until we're consistently above 50 degrees at night.
Okay.
But Jesse, I think maybe what Judy's talking about is when I know where some of my plants are, like my Jacob's ladders, my early emergers. I will take a rake, a stick, as you said, whatever I can reach into the bed, and just shift the leaves away from the center of the plant. And that's it. I don't pick them up. I don't move them. They're still right where they fell almost, but they're not making a 4-inch mat, which I think is a little bit thick for the early emergers. And then as soon as you see your early emergers starting to come out, you can shift the leaves a little bit more around the base, just make sure they can pop through. A lot of them will pop through, but it's harder for them if they have to pop through 4 inches of solid leaves. So I think shifting them around at this point especially is pretty fine, as long as you don't pick them up, crunch them, like Jesse said, step on them or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a lot of sticks I can go out and just poke around things with. That's actually extremely helpful. And thank you.
Yeah. And I find myself putting a lot of bamboo stakes when I plant something so that I can see it under leaf litter and I will know where to just jiggle things around a little bit instead of trying to rely on memory, which I have none of where things are or where I think they are. And I find a lot of times that my plants will emerge a little bit different from my stake, that they found a little microclimate 6 inches to the left of my stake that they liked better and emerged from there versus where I thought I put them. So that might help in the future for being able to move around your leaves in a delicate manner. I think I only have a couple more here. These are 2 woody-ish plants. They're herbaceous that they essentially die down to mostly the ground. I think once they get older, more established root systems, they may keep more top woody growth up above, but yellow root on the left and goat's beard on the right, they're emerging about the same time. They look very similar. I only know the difference because I labeled them. So I don't know identifying characteristics to tell you how to tell these 2 apart, but you can tell on the right with the goat's beard that it keeps a very woody bottom section. That's why I believe that as it gets older, it will hold on to more of those twig-like structures. I could be wrong. We'll see how it develops, but both interesting plants. And then a few volunteers that I've gotten in my raised garden beds, unfortunately, but I'm compromising. Culver's root on the left and probably tall goldenrod. It might be Canadian goldenrod, but I think that when Mike was here, he said most of what we call Canadian goldenrod is actually tall goldenrod. So it's everywhere. It spreads by underground runners that are aggressively outrageous. A whole lot of them. So that's coming up. Mike, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I was just gonna say you're right. It spreads outrageously aggressively.
Yeah.
It's one of those things, though, it's easy to pull it by the stem and pull it back to control it so it doesn't overwhelm other things. It will crowd out a lot of other native meadow plants. And the
Yes.
tall goldenrod, altissima and lake, it's confusing. Anyway, Solidega gigantea is the other one that's very similar. Canadensis is similar. I think it's a little less common around here. I don't see it as much, but they're all the 3 species that are all very similar in how they spread and grow. They're the ones that have, if you look at the leaf, it has 3 veins, a central vein and 2 parallel veins. There's only one other woodlands. What is the other? There's one other species that has that, but those three aggressive ones that have those three veined leaves. I just pull them up where I don't want them and let them grow elsewhere.
Yes, that's what I'm doing. I find that I had tried to clear a bed last year of them. There are still plenty of volunteers, though. I had wheelbarrows full of the stalks and the plants and the roots. I did not get near all of them. So yes, it'll be a continuing compromise for sure. And then that was it. Audrey, you wrote a recap for us. Do you want to touch on that?
Yes, and then we'll get back to the grow it, build it real quick. If Jesse, do you think that you could possibly, when we're done with this slide, pull up the album that I sent you guys? With all of the pictures?
I should be able to, yeah.
Okay. So just to recap some strategies that I've employed trying to identify native plants near me, just observation, what stands out about the plant? Is it the flower color? Does it have an interesting leaf shape, an interesting leaf color or pattern? Where is it growing? Is it in a wet area, shady, sunny, rocky? And pull from knowledge you already have. Then I go straight to my native plant book collection. I look at a bunch of pictures and try to ID from there. I will try familiar native plant websites. Edge of the Woods is one I always go to. I'll ask other native plant enthusiasts, friends, or look at online native plant forums. You can take pictures and use an app on your phone, such as iNaturalist or Picture This, if you keep in mind that they're not always accurate. And if all else fails, wait for more identifying features to appear, such as a flower, and try these strategies all over again. And so just to talk about the article that Jesse sent me real quick, they actually were starting a little bit of a database, and they had pictures on there of the tiny little, emerging seedlings. And then as the plant grew a little bit more and a little bit more. And so that was really helpful, but there wasn't a ton on there. So what we're thinking of creating is a database, and doing that, applying that to WOD 1 SEPA. And this could be, okay, so these are ones that I took from my work with the volunteer plant group here. And I kind of thought maybe we could all add to this. And as long as our pictures are clear and we're absolutely positive about our identification, you'll see these tags are we're having our first plant sale the end of this month. So I was just there at the greenhouse yesterday helping to put these tags in all of the pots. But so the more pictures we have at various stages, the easier it will be for people to identify things. So, if you do some winter seed sowing and you know exactly what you're growing in what pots, and you can contribute in that way, that would be really helpful. So I just thought this would be a neat way for us to do something interactive and together as a chapter. So you guys feel free to throw your thoughts out there if you're interested, and if you think it's a good idea or not. And also, if anybody wants to contribute any other strategies that you employ for identifying, or if there's anything else that you guys want to discuss, go for it.
Audrey, I think it's a great idea. Thank you so much. I will have to figure out how to maybe, I don't know if there will be a way to organize them into categories or something that'll make it easier for people to search it for information. Yes. We'll have to kind of brainstorm about that, but I think it's going to be a great resource. There's not a lot out there. You're right, to try and identify things, especially in really early stages. And it's usually a trial and error that you let it grow until you can identify it. And then sometimes it's a great thing, and other times it's an invasive you now just let grow a bit because you were trying to figure out what it was. So we will have people add to it as we can. We'll figure out how we have to make it amendable and accessible to everybody. So we've talked about this last week. I don't want people to forget, we're going to have our native plant swap and our invasive trade-in. Bring your pictures, not your plants. We don't need your garlic mustard, but pictures that you pulled it are really great. And then you get a native plant in return. Audrey, you put this beautiful, beautiful picture in here. You know how to sucker me in. Go ahead.
So for anyone who's on Telegram, I just recently started a channel there for Wild One SEPA, and this is basically just telling you where you can find us there. The advantage of having the Telegram channel is that we can also share things from other like-minded groups. So you'll see I posted some the composting 5, can't remember the exact title, but 5 steps to home or backyard composting that Living Landscapes just put out from Colleen Felicki. I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but they just had a workshop not long ago, so that's on there. So yeah, we'll have some really cool stuff on there. If you guys have Telegram, want to check it out. If you don't have Telegram, the telegram.org is where you go to. It's a free app you can put on your phone or computer.
Awesome. And from what I understand, this is a way to reach people that don't know they want native plants or know much about native plants. So it's just another way to spread the word. Our upcoming opportunities, I think a couple of these we had hit last week, but I wanted to share. So we're having our plant swap and invasive trade-in at the John James Audubon Center. And they have a couple of special events. In fact, they're having an Earth Day native plant sale on the 23rd. If you're in that area and want to stop by, their website probably has more information. This was a screenshot that I took and I did not get a chance to look more into it, but that was exciting to hear that there's going to be a native plant sale there. Doug Tallamy is going to be sponsored in Allentown. I saw this off of the Edge of the Woods information. So if you haven't gotten a chance to see him, maybe check that out. He is well worth any price of admission, really, to hear his message. Nurseries or plant sales that we know about are on here. We covered this last week also. Lots of great things coming up. Hopefully you're getting out there to the nurseries to support your native plant nurseries. Upcoming events. This was, I think, the same slide as last week. We're excited for this Lancaster Native Plant and Wildlife Festival. And then afterward, Mark invited us over. And like it wasn't going to be amazing enough that we were going to get to watch his or see his property, see the things that he's trying to do there. But then he said, oh, I forgot to mention my wife is a really great baker and I'm going to have treats for you guys, and oh, I'll probably also have a plant for everybody to take with them. So I was like, stop, I'm never gonna leave, Mark, if you keep making this deal so sweet.
Well, you're all welcome to come. So yeah, and see what I'm doing, what I did wrong and what I'm trying to improve. So it'll be fun.
It's gonna be a good time. So we'll meet up after the festival. We'll head over to Mark's anytime after 1, he said. The rest of our year in monthly meetings, nothing has changed. I just highlighted that we're going to meet at Jenkins Arboretum the week before that. So that's next Friday, right? I think the 21st at 9:30 Jenkins Arboretum. Anybody who wants to join us, we're going to chat about plants and walk around. The Earth Day event is happening at Reservoir Park. There's lots of Earth Day events. So if you're not in Phoenixville, check out your local Earth Day event. Tell them about native plants and how that's the only way we can save the earth. And we talked about the other 2 events, what's happening the rest of the year. I came across this yesterday or today, and I like to highlight organizations, businesses that are trying to do landscaping the way we want them to. And this company, Wildcraft Landscapes, is based out of Berks County, based in Wyomissing. Full service design and installation of native plants. They have a native plant focus. They do regular lawn maintenance also, but in ecologically friendly ways. And they try and encourage the reduction in turf grass lawns and the increase in native plants. So I will be adding these to the list I have going of landscapers that are trying to do the right thing. And then our nursery list that is ongoing. I'm checking to see, I think this is our last slide. And that's our last slide. So I'm gonna stop sharing. See everybody's faces. And check the chat. Yes, I agree, Marilyn. My Virgin's Bowers, the native clematis, is being, it's not out of control, but it's happy. It is definitely happy. Does anybody have any other questions or anything? We ran pretty long tonight, so
Yeah, and if anybody wants to share any of their strategies for IDing, that would be helpful too.
I use PlantNet. It's an app on my phone. It seems to be pretty helpful, and it's free, which is good because there's a whole bunch that are, oh, we have a free trial, and then you know, it's $59 a year or $14 a month or something. It's like, I just want to know if this is a weed or not, for crying out loud.
Right.
I just downloaded iNaturalist while we were here. Nice to see that it's also free, although they request a donation, which I'm happy to donate to something like that.
right.
But PlantNet's been pretty good so far. Although it did tell me that the turtle head was like wild lettuce. I'm like, I don't think so. I was gonna wait and let it,
Yeah.
you know, come up some more and then try again, because it's, again, not perfect, but it was me going, you know, I know I planted the turtle head somewhere. I just don't remember where.
Right. And it's a starting point, right? It rules out a lot of things, and it narrows down your options so that you can research a little more and corroborate stories and, you know, come up with an answer. So I'll take a wrong answer that is close, that will get me to the right answer, versus no answer at all.
Right. And if it comes out and says, you know, invasive, run away, then I know just to pull it, because I'll trust it with things like that. But if, you know, something like, I was pretty sure I planted the turtle head around there somewhere, and I literally didn't remember what it looked like, and I don't know what happened to the other one.
But that is a good point, that you have to take some of the information that they load into those programs with a grain of salt,
Right.
depending on what their crowd focus is, who they think their target audience is. They may be giving you information to pull your milkweed, for example, when I just want it as an ID. I don't need the information for making decisions about what I'm going to do with it. I just want you to tell me what it is.
Oh, it didn't actually say to pull it out or anything. The first thing I took, we had a thing that was about 12, 14 inches tall with little white flowers, and there was only one of it. So I looked it up on PlantNet, and it told me that it was not native. So I told George, and he pulled it out. And then there were these little moundy things of even tinier white flowers. And I forget what it said they were, but it's kind of like, well, they can be in this area. So we left those. And then I wanted to see what the other thing was, because it had broad leaves, and I didn't remember having anything with broad leaves necessarily. There aren't a lot of things that we planted in that one specific garden. And it said wild lettuce. And I'm like, except that the picture of the wild lettuce didn't exactly match. I think it had like roughly edged leaves and this is smooth leaves, or the other way around. I forget which. Anyway, I left it. I figure I'll give it more time until I verify really what it is. We have a vine. We put up 3 bluebird boxes today. And one of the trees that George put one of them up on has a vine growing on it that it might be, what's that, Rose?
Oh,
Virginia creeper?
no, not Virginia creeper.
Oh, that stupid rose.
Multiflora
Yeah, he
rose.
thinks it might be multiflora rose, but it's definitely a vine. And it's not spiky like the other. He did take out some multiflora rose. So I'm gonna take the phone over there and take pictures of it and check on a few things.
Either honeysuckle or Virginia creeper or bittersweet. And it's usually the non-native bittersweet, but you might be lucky and have the native.
Okay,
Those are the
Yeah.
vines. Or
okay.
grape, oh God, or grape, which is native, but you know what? Rip it out because
Yeah,
it'll-
I know it's not grape
you know, grape.
because the leaves are sort of small and oval. So it's probably, I don't think it's multiflora, but.
That's
you know,
not honeysuckle either, if they're small and oval.
Yeah.
Honeysuckle's already out now. It's going crazy everywhere.
The other thing that we could do with this Google sharing is maybe create, if we're going to categorize different things for easy ID, maybe we'll be able to put in we don't know what this is, identification thing, or bring your pictures to meetings and we
Yeah.
collectively can see if we can identify things.
That's a good idea. I
Everybody
like
can
that.
share their screen and then we can, shout out the answer to like Jeopardy or.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's not Virginia creeper because it doesn't have
It
5
doesn't have
leaves,
that,
it
yeah.
has 2 leaves.
Mhm.
Okay, then it's probably bittersweet.
Okay.
It's smooth bark.
Oh gosh, it's showing me.
Virginia creeper has a knobbly aspect to it. Bittersweet is smooth.
Okay,
Wait, I need to see
Or
the.
its roots, you know what that's
Everything is
definitive.
showing me the berries. It's not showing me the leaves.
If you pull out the roots and they're bright orange, that's bittersweet and you should have pulled it out.
Okay.
okay.
Okay. I don't-
Since it's climbing up a tree, if it is bittersweet, I'll just, take a
Snip it off. At the
snip it
bottom.
off at the bottom and, leave a gap.
You'll have to do it again. You should.
I
get
know.
crown.
I'm fighting the multiflora rose and, and
Same
the,
thing.
so yeah, it's just it's a battle.
Yeah, you cut those with loppers below the root crown and it's much less likely that the roots will
Yeah, I
regenerate.
like that
something.
idea too, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I would say it's bittersweet, judging by this one picture I found with the leaves.
There you go. They're starting to bud. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, success.
Yay,
I can
see?
tell you bittersweet. I'm familiar with that look. If you have a photo. It's got little speckly things on the stem too.
Okay.
And the lenticles or whatever you call them.
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll take a look
I'll
at
have
that
to look
too.
at that too. So you have to cut it at chest height and at ankle height.
Yeah. Wow, that's a big jump there.
Yeah, it says aggressive resprouting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good night, Denise. Denise just put in the chat that she had to go, and I probably should call it a night too. I think this is it was another wonderful meeting. Thank you all for attending. The discussion part is always really great. I think that if we try and do the pictures, like do almost a show and tell or ID this or something for next meeting, maybe we can put that in the invite so people can be prepared, but always know you're welcome to share any pictures or any stories, anything you need to. I would love not talking all the time. It would be great. I don't mind talking all the time, but I definitely don't need to. So
I think it sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I like it.
The Flora Incognita and Seek.
Yes, those are two that I use. Flora Incognita is based in Great Britain, so a lot of your responses are leaning in that direction, but both of them work really well and they're different. They work differently.
Okay.
So I like both of them.
Excellent.
The
Real
first way I
quick,
spelled it was wrong. The second way I spelled it was correct.
And Seek is by iNaturalist.
Yes, it is.
That's funny.
Yeah.
And you do it, you kind of move your phone around the plant, but Flora Incognita has you take a picture of a this and of that, you know, the flower or the
Yeah.
bud or the whatever.
Okay.
So they're both good.
Audrey has something to say there also.
Oh, thanks. I just wanted to ask Susan if she could please put the Grow It, Build It link in the newsletter,
Oh, yeah.
because
That's a good-
I
good
forgot to
source.
do that, and that way everyone will have a better idea of what I was talking about.
Audrey, how do you feel about sharing all your photos with non-wild one people?
I am fine with it as long as I asked my husband this and he said it's not a problem, but I just want to be absolutely positively sure that by sharing that link, I'm not giving people access to any personal information, or you know, nobody's gonna hack into my computer or anything.
Right.
If we just send out a PDF, would that be a hackable thing?
No,
No.
No, but then it's also not editable by
Yeah.
other people
Yeah.
either. They can't add to it.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we'll have to brainstorm how best to implement this. It's a great idea. It'll be a good resource. But we could, just off the top of my head, we could have specific editors on it, and then everybody else just has access as viewers, and that
Hmm.
might limit your liability for who could have access to anything.
Okay, because I know when you sent me the presentation, it said you know, that I didn't need like a password or something. So be careful who you send it to. So
And that's because you're not on Gmail. If you send it to anybody with a Gmail address, you don't get that warning.
oh, okay. You could send it to my Gmail account, but I found a way around it anyway. It was okay. But yeah, so I'm fine with it as long as
We were at Brandywine the other day trying to ID some baby plants, and I knew you had just done this, and I was thinking they would really appreciate it, but I didn't want it without your permission.
oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks guys. Yeah, I've asked my son who's knows all things computer to verify that for me, just to get his
That's a
2
great
cents.
idea.
He's always been, you know, interested in security too. So
Good
I will
idea.
double check, get back to you guys, and yeah, if it's not an issue, I don't care where it goes, you know.
Awesome.
But thanks
All
for
right, guys.
asking.
Good night.
Good night,
Night,
everybody.
guys.
Everybody,
Great
great
meeting.
meeting.
Nice to see
Yeah.
you
Night
guys.
all.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.